Tēnā koe te wanaunga, Rachel. We're here this afternoon on the whenua of our tūpuna here at Pipitea, on Pipitea Pā, to talk a little bit about your book, Te Motunui Epa. And I thought that a nice place to start might be for to talk a little bit about the Epa themselves, and then maybe we can get into a little bit more around the records in the book.
Sounds good. Yeah, tēnā koe Honiana. It's lovely to be here with you, and I acknowledge our shared history in this place that's now known as Wellington, and also your expertise as someone who's caring for audiovisual and film taonga on behalf of all New Zealanders. So I'm mihi to you and your work in that zone. It's really important, as my research on this book has shown. So the Epa, well, they're masterpieces created by people in Taranaki in the 1700s. Probably, I think, not just one carver, but a group of carvers made these panels. So the word Epa describes a wall of a pātaka or storehouse, and these carvings were probably made for one or two different pātaka and then shaped to form this back wall. The artistry in the carvings is, I think, the result of hundreds of years of building up of cultural knowledge and expertise, and you can see how beautiful they are. Anyway, these carvings were made, they were placed on a pātaka in just north of Waitara, around that area, and then when the wars started, when invaders came from the north in the early 1800s, they were dismantled and placed carefully in a swamp. Some people know the swamp as Pero, others call it Waipapa. The name's not so important, as that was a place that was known for safekeeping. And I think our ancestors would have imagined that they would have come back to collect the carvings, but those musket wars, so-called, lasted for quite some time. People fled, as we both know, many of our tupuna fled down to Whanganui a Tara, and others were captured or killed. Anyway, once people started going back to Taranaki, then the wars of colonisation happened. So long story short, the carvings were never retrieved. They just sank beneath the surface there and had a very long sleep, and were asleep in the swamp, safely preserved there until 1971, when they woke up, and that's when this book begins. So my research really starts from that period and traces what happened after that. So they emerged when a ditch was being dug on the land that Pākehā were leasing from the Māori owners. They were taken by Melville Manukonga, who then sold them on to a British art dealer who smuggled them out of New Zealand, sold them to George Ortiz, and they were taken to Geneva. And they would have probably stayed in hiding. I think we wouldn't have known anything about them, but for the fact that George's daughter was kidnapped by Italian criminals, and to raise the money to repay his mother, he sold a number of his artworks. He called them primitive artworks, and they were put up for auction at Sotheby's. So, and by happenstance, really, the New Zealand government learned that the provenance connected with these carvings was false, and began what I really think is unprecedented legal action in 1978 to retrieve them. So my book really begins at that moment, 1971, and traces nearly 40 years of effort on behalf of successive governments, Labour and National, to bring our tupuna back.
One of the amazing things about this book, and certainly one of the things that drew me to this story, is the use of archives and actually being able to tell this story. Now, we've seen this often in the Waitangi Tribunal and other claims by Māori of that sort of reigniting our history through the Crown record. Both you and I have worked a long time with archives, and I just find it quite amazing that there's a second story underlying the first story of the record of government, the path that they took. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like in exploring the archival taonga that you use in the book to basically underpin this entire story?
Yeah, well, I want to, before I answer, I want to mihi to you, because you suggested that I make an OIA request, and I'd never done one of those requests before, and it really, if it wasn't for that intervention, I'm not sure this book would have existed, because it was an almost throwaway activity on my part, because I was just exploring and seeing, now I look back, I was obviously quite purposeful, but it didn't feel like that at the time. But once I made a request of the Crown, it was clear there was just such a treasure trove of archival records that really hadn't been paid particular attention to and were scattered amongst many different government departments. So the collection of records that I guess ignited this book was the 2 boxes of material at Crown Law, and I had to get, the Attorney General waived legal privilege so I could look at those records. So I was already quite, that felt special, what would it be? And just opening up those boxes was like a real sensation. I mean, the records hadn't been arranged or described at all. They were just sort of in bundles with rubber bands and had a bit haphazard. As soon as I started looking at them, I felt this real sense of excitement. What was documented there was just very important. And there was 2 stories. Just that first box of records I looked at, there was the Roger Duff affidavit. So I recognised his name as the head of Canterbury Museum, and the fact that he'd been in London on the shopping trip, he'd had lunch with George Ortiz, and even that there were affidavits. I had no idea the police had been involved and lawyers. And then I started flicking through, and then down the side of that box, I could see land court records, Māori land court records, and I recognised all the names on the bit of paper. And I was like, what are they doing here? And it was like there's 2 stories happening at the same time. I was quite surprised by that. And it actually took me quite a long time to piece together what that all meant. So without those archival records and the memory of the Crown and the resources of the Crown and keeping them, I think many of the events documented in this book would have sunk beneath, like the Epa did, because there wasn't memory retained in Taranaki about it, because a lot of the activity happened behind the backs of the people who actually are from there. The Crown was doing its work to try and, the legal action, there was no consultation with Te Atiawa. I mean, it was the 1970s. Once I started working with the records, Honiana, it wasn't just Crown Law, it was Archives New Zealand, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DIA cared for records, but from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, and even Te Puni Kokiri, Te Arawhiti. I realised that those records had I started trying to turn my thinking around. What if I saw the records as being created by the carvings themselves rather than being created by the Crown? So I think because I did a lot of this work in lockdown in Melbourne, I was on my own a lot, we couldn't go anywhere. I went very much inside myself and was able to start imagining something different and really thinking, what if I have a totally different view of this? What are these records? If the carvings carved their way around the world and the records, I saw them as like the chips coming off a carver, how would I treat them? And we've discussed in the past, archival records are really, really powerful. There's all sorts of knowledge contained in them, and they do need to be treated with care and reverence, particularly when they're connected with the Māori world. That's my view, yeah.
You've talked a little bit about the voice that you used in the book, and it's quite a unique way to try and put yourselves, I don't suppose you can say in the shoes of, can you? So they don't really have shoes, but in the tapuwai, in the footsteps of our tupuna, of these Epa. Can you talk a little bit about why you felt that was the right way to take the conversation?
As I started working on this book, I thought I only had 6 months of time. That was the amount I had off my paid job. And I thought I just want to write a really good essay, so that I've documented all of this, it doesn't get forgotten again. And that was what I started doing. But then I was like, I want to do a bit more. And I started looking at the Ortiz whānau, and I started imagining, so George Ortiz is the grandson of Simon Patino, and they were tin miners from Bolivia, multi-billionaires, rich beyond what we can imagine. And once I started researching that family, I started thinking in my head, how would it be imagining an encounter between that family and the Epa on a marae? And what it would be like, what happens when you're greeting someone, who are these people? And I think that was probably the start of me imagining a voice for our tupuna, and I thought, what would they think of this family? What would they make of them? So I just started playing around. I was just playing around. And then I got more and more into that. Okay, what sort of, this is obviously a collection of people that are here, so it's a collective. And how would they speak? And would they tell jokes? Would they have feelings? And I thought, yeah, they would. I just decided I'm going to just go there. The film, the Ted Nia films, the 2 films from the 1980s were really helpful because Mahara Okiroa, who's been a mentor through this whole process. His mother was one of the kuia interviewed, and that beautiful, simple Māori that those women spoke, and it's been translated by Ruakere Hond and Huirangi Waikere Peru. I found that so resonant, like just the simplicity of the statements there, and I tried to start imagining that voice, you know, combined with, I guess, how I've heard people speak. I mean, my Māori is not really, it's scraps, but that use of humour, and the use of humour to actually make serious points. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. You know, I don't like it that so many of our masterpieces are in museums or elsewhere and are voiceless. I don't like it that there's not a name, there's no artist's name. The provenance is terrible. And I really wanted to try and bring them to life. So I just took a risk, I mean, and I thought, what would be interesting for a reader and what would be interesting for me? And that's why I did it. I just kept going. And then, you know, I got sort of, I was like, okay, because I didn't want to put myself in this book, but I wanted to have someone, a voice making a commentary. Yeah. And I thought, why not have the Epa making a commentary? And I guess some of those feelings in the book about yearning for home and yearning to be touched, which I really believe that Taonga do yearn for that. But it was also my yearning, being stuck in Australia and not being able to get home, not being able to come and see my mother who was so unwell, not being able to spend time in Taranaki as I had planned for this book, and feeling actually in the start of the pandemic that I would never be able to come back. Like when I talk about the Epa in there, about how they would feel on the plane with a sense of panic, because you imagine, like, they were made in Taranaki in the old world and then were displayed on a pātaka doing their thing for not very long, then placed in a swamp, and then to suddenly be smuggled and on the other side of the world, it would have been a really big shock. You know, like, I think they would have been really frightened as well as everything else. So I sort of tried to imagine all that. I just thought, why not? Why not try and do it? It's up to readers to decide what they think. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah. I think it's. I think it really brings through a wairua Māori into it. You know, I mean, the thing for me when I read through it, as a person who, as a young person, grew up with a lot of these people. I worked on Te Māori exhibition, and for me there was so much in there about relationships. It was the nuance of the relationships of these taonga that was encapsulated within the archival record, but also the people who swirled around that, and you talk about that a lot in the book, about the people who were involved, the relationships. Did you get much of a chance to connect with those people, to talk with them about their experiences?
Thanks for raising that. Yes, so relationships to me are the key to this story, and that was the key to empowering the Epa to speak, is starting to think about how does someone, like, how did these taonga demonstrate their rangatiratanga? And that was about their ability to draw people to them and to keep people close to them. I mean, that's what it... So some of the people have passed away. Like, I was sad to see that Sir Charles Grey died in March. So he acted for the New Zealand government. He was a young up-and-coming QC, and was obviously completely brilliant, because I interviewed Sir Ted Thomas. He's a retired Supreme Court judge, and he spoke with a great deal of feeling about being lacerated by Charles Grey, how brilliant he was, how he lampooned him, you know, that. So it's lovely speaking to people later in their life and letting them revisit. So Ted Thomas, you know, it was really exciting for him. He was called up by Ortiz to act as an expert on New Zealand law, and he could remember everything about going to London and walking into this room, and there were 17 senior barristers in the room in their robes. He'd seen nothing like it. So sort of entering as someone from New Zealand, the centre of colonial power, really. But he talked about his relationship with Ortiz as well. Likewise, Lance Entwistle, who smuggled the carvings out. I mean, what's interesting about the art world is that it's also about relationships, and actually about utu and about exchange. So, you know, Entwistle encountered and his wife, the Epa, in New Plymouth, and that relationship has been maintained right to this day. Lance and Bobby attended George Ortiz's funeral. They kept an interest, so they were joined. Likewise, Professor Stephen Hooper, I interviewed him too via Zoom. So it was, he talked with great feeling about his relationship with these carvings and with the Ortiz family and with his grandfather. So that's sort of all Pākehā world people, but it was just fascinating to me that they, Robert Bleakley was another example. So he was a young auctioneer in London in 78. He'd just moved from Australia and probably, I don't think from an especially privileged background, but he was an educated young guy, but he was the auctioneer. So he would have handled all the taonga, including the Epa, remembered it very well, remembered the injunction and the Epa being withdrawn. And then that auction was so successful it made Bleakley's name. Sotheby's then established a Department of Primitive Art, so-called, because of the record-breaking prices. Then Robert Bleakley returned to Australia and was allowed to start Sotheby's Australia. But he kept the relationship with Ortiz and then later became an intermediary. So in around 2006, 2007, was acting on behalf of Ortiz to try and yet again get the New Zealand government to purchase the carvings. And I really liked it when he told me that one of the things he tried to do was contact the National Gallery of Australia and say, listen, Robert Muldoon gave you a Colin McCann in the 1970s, Victory Over Death. It's one of your biggest treasures. Why don't you buy these carvings and gift them back to New Zealand in exchange? And I thought that was actually a really good idea. He didn't get anywhere with it, but I thought, yeah, they should give something in exchange. And I loved it that in his art dealer mind, they were totally equivalent. That it was actually, so he transcended those terrible divisions about primitive and modern, and he was able to see. So, yeah, I found those long-term relationships were just really interesting. And likewise, those sort of relationships with very privileged British people, like Peter Wilson, the chair of Sotheby's, how he personally tried to intervene and went to the New Zealand High Commission to sort of say, listen, chaps, you just need to spend a bit of money, you can have the carvings and we'll shut this down. That's what I liked. These archival records really gave me and hopefully readers an insight into what are normally closed worlds of privilege. So how the diplomatic service works, how the art world works, how the legal world works. And I did find it fascinating.
So Rachel, just to wrap things up, and you talked very briefly about utu, which you go into in a lot of depth in the book, but to wrap things up, what has been the response from the Ngāti Rāhiri people, Te Atiawa people, to this book? Obviously the response to the Epa coming back was huge, I was there, but how are they feeling about the book?
Yes, so I would never say that I could speak for all of Ngāti Rāhiri or Te Atiawa. As you know, Te Atiawa, we are very diverse. But I did have a special day on Friday with Keith Holswich from Ngāti Rāhiri, who's their Wāhi Tapu coordinator, and we actually went around some of the spots. So one of the amazing things about this research that I'm really happy about is that through finding out about the Crown's, after the legal action failed at the House of Lords, they then decided that they would fund action on behalf of owners of Ngāti Rāhiri, the block of land where the Epa had been asleep, and that these 4 representative owners would sue Ortiz direct. So legal opinions were obtained, and then Department of Māori Affairs and the Surveyor General of New Plymouth actually took Manukonga back, and he showed them the spot where the Epa emerged, and it was mapped. So that has now created, that's where he said they came up, and you have to believe he was telling the truth. So, but that spot is so incredible, Honiana, and to know that, so I went with Keith, and to feel the wairua of that place and to look at that beautiful piece of land, like I went there yesterday and there was no water. Like sometimes when I first saw it, there was a little wetland still there, despite all the trees being cut down. But yesterday it was just like a scar. So there was the grass, but then there was this green shape, and you've got the huge synfuel plant in the background. You've got all this exploration, extraction there, and yet these taonga slept there all that time, just waiting. So I feel without being able to speak for everyone, I feel that this has added another layer to the homecoming. It's another way that these epa can speak with us as uri of Taranaki about the possibilities that are there for us as creative people. And that's what I take as deeply creative people who are descended from these geniuses, really. You know, and so I see it as a story of real hope and transformation for us, because it's not a story about war. These taonga were asleep through all of that. It's a different kind of story. And that's what I kept working with Honiana is, what are we being told here? What can we hang on to? What are the old people offering us? And I feel it's just it's an amazing source of power for us. So I hope that others of our relatives can share in that. You know, when I went to Waitara in the middle of the year to present the manuscript of the book with Mahara and my sister Hana, and it was a small, you know, it was a little room on a Sunday, a hui, there was maybe 30 people there, and we went around and I met some people, Hana met them, but we counted up afterwards how many artists were in the room, and I couldn't believe it. Weavers, writers, painters, and I don't mean they're big names. I mean, we have big names. Rangi Kipa, obviously, you've worked with, Hemi Sundrin, Nahino Hohaya, some of those people are in the book. These were people that are just doing this. Now, what are the stats on that? This small room, all these artists, it's amazing. So that's sort of what I hope that others can take that from it, despite all the pain and suffering, all the things that happened in Taranaki, in Waitara, for Te Atiawa, for Ngāti Rahiri, this has emerged. You know, I think this is probably the only book about a New Zealand artwork, one book devoted to this work. It's not about an exhibition, it's about one piece of work. So, you know, to my Taranaki, isn't it? Really? Yeah.
Kia ora.